Hello and welcome to the Coin Bureau. My name is Guy, and in today's video we'll be looking at... Do you know what? You've probably seen and heard enough of me lately. Here on this channel we're always looking to showcase new talent, and I'm delighted that we've recently welcomed a brand new presenter in the form of the excellent DC Roth. So, for today's deep dive into a little-known chemical that keeps the world turning, I'm going to leave you in his capable hands. I'll be back soon with another video, but in the meantime, DC, over to you.
Right now, all the talk is of crude oil recently sparking to over $110 a barrel. But there's an even more critical shortage unfolding in the background of the global economy. A vital chemical building block that powers the modern world is rapidly vanishing from the market, and that means a global manufacturing freeze will affect every single one of us. My name is DC. It's a pleasure to be a part of Team Coin Bureau, and now let's talk about a substance that most people have never even heard of. The base layer of the global manufacturing system relies on a highly specialized petrochemical feedstock known as naphtha. Naphtha is a highly volatile liquid hydrocarbon mixture that is produced during the fractional distillation of crude oil. Now, it sits right in the middle of the refinery output spectrum, making it lighter than diesel, but heavier than standard gasoline. In Asian manufacturing circles, this substance is also referred to as the rice of industry, because it feeds absolutely everything. Now, here comes the science bit. Bear with me because this is actually pretty important. Naphtha serves as the primary raw ingredient that gets loaded into massive industrial furnaces known as steam crackers. Now, inside these facilities, the liquid is vaporized and rapidly heated to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius for at least fractions of a second. This extreme thermal stress breaks the longer hydrocarbon chains into much shorter and highly reactive molecules. These resulting molecules include ethylene, propylene, and butadiene, which serve as foundational building blocks for modern manufacturing. Without these specific chemical outputs, the production of pretty much everything, of medical-grade plastics, food packaging, and synthetic rubber becomes physically impossible. And because the Middle Eastern countries produce incredibly light and waxy crude oils, they are the undisputed global heavyweights of naphtha production. Now, under normal conditions, Asian manufacturing hubs import roughly 4 to 5 million metric tons of this naphtha every single month. Now, this massive volume of trade feeds a downstream consumer goods market valued at an astonishing $3.8 trillion globally. But following the outbreak of the war with Iran in late February of 2026, the primary artery for this chemical trade has been severed. The Strait of Hormuz normally processes around 130 commercial vessel transits every single day, serving as the gateway for the vast majority of Asia's naphtha imports. Throughout March, however, that daily transit averaged collapsed to fewer than 3 vessels per day. This represents the elimination of approximately 3.4 million tons of essential manufacturing feedstock from the global system in a matter of weeks. And the reason this waterway shut down so completely comes down to the shadowy inner workings of maritime trade. You see, even when the physical strait remains navigable, European banks have outright refused to issue letters of credit for cargoes originating in the Gulf. Furthermore, marine insurers have either completely withdrawn their coverage or imposed prohibitive war risk premiums that make journeys commercially unviable. This creates a situation wherein ships cannot simply sail because they can't secure the mandatory insurance policies required by international law. And while some crude oil can be diverted through specialized bypass pipelines in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, those alternative routes are strictly configured for crude. They can't carry refined naphtha, meaning this vital chemical feedstock is physically trapped inside the Persian Gulf. To compound the issue, Kuwait's massive Al Zour refinery was recently hit by drone strikes and forced to declare its own state of force majeure. This means the upstream production facilities are being destroyed at the exact same time that the downstream shipping lanes are being blockaded. And the immediate consequence of this geographical bottleneck has been an absolutely unprecedented explosion in global spot prices. Back in late February, the benchmark price for naphtha delivered to Japan and Korea was sitting at roughly $622 per metric ton. By the middle of March, this assessment had skyrocketed past $1,050 per metric ton, representing a 70% price increase in just 4 weeks. And as you can guess, this places a massive strain on the petrochemical industry because to operate a steam cracker profitably, a facility requires a break-even spread of at least $300 per ton between their raw input costs and their finished output value. So when the benchmark price breached that $1,000 threshold, the cracking margin completely collapsed to negative $149 per ton. This means that for every single ton of material these facilities process, they are actively destroying capital and locking in massive financial losses. Rational factory managers do not wait for their physical storage tanks to hit absolute zero before taking drastic action, right? They shut down their operations the exact moment that the equation turns negative to prevent hemorrhaging cash. And this margin collapse is currently triggering a wave of industrial closures that will ultimately pass massive costs directly down to us consumers. But before we dive into the consequences of this factory freeze, if you want to stay informed, make better investment decisions, and keep ahead of the market shocks like this one, then you need the Coin Bureau Telegram channel. It's your all-in-one newsfeed to keep you up to date with what's happening in crypto and the wider economy, meaning you'll always be up to date with the info that you actually need. So click the link in the description below or simply scan this QR code right here to get started. And now back to the rapid disintegration of the Asian manufacturing sector. South Korea operates some of the most highly efficient and complex industrial plants on the face of the earth. But because they historically import roughly 77% of their naphtha from the Middle East, they are currently bearing the brunt of this crisis. Yeochun NCC, which is South Korea's largest ethylene producer, was forced to declare force majeure and shuttered 2 massive cracking centers in early March. This single declaration effectively eliminated 60% of their annual production capacity overnight. LG Chem quickly followed suit by permanently shutting down their massive facility in the Yeosu industrial complex, removing another 800,000 tons capacity from the market. Lotte Chemical also halted their primary ethylene plant and accelerated a long-planned restructuring program just to survive the margin compression. These are not temporary pauses for scheduled maintenance or minor operational hiccups. They are the beginnings of a structural breakdown of the industrial base because the foundational raw materials are simply too expensive to process. And this contagion of factory closures is spreading rapidly across Asia. In Japan, massive conglomerates like Mitsubishi Chemical and Mitsui Chemicals have been forced to drastically reduce their ethylene output to avoid total operational suspension. Or in Taiwan, the Formosa Plastics Group has issued sweeping force majeure notices across multiple product lines due to insufficient upstream raw materials. Even facilities in Indonesia and Singapore have begun issuing formal notifications to their customers that they can no longer fulfill their contractual obligations. Now, when a corporation declares force majeure, they are legally notifying the market that extraordinary events beyond their control prevent the delivery of goods. This legal mechanism effectively removes the contractual obligation to supply these vital chemicals, creating a massive production void in the global economy. The South Korean government has officially designated this chemical feedstock as an economic security item and imposed a strict 5-month export ban to hoard whatever domestic supply remains. They even managed to secure an emergency shipment of 27,000 metric tons of Russian product using a temporary sanctions waiver. But to put the sheer scale of this crisis into perspective, that emergency Russian delivery contains only enough material to sustain, wait for it, domestic operations for 3 days. And this regional devastation brings us nicely to the massive divergence occurring within the global petrochemical industry. While Asian and European manufacturers are facing an existential crisis due to their reliance on crude-derived naphtha, North American producers are experiencing an incredible boom. Facilities in the United States predominantly use ethane, which is a natural gas derivative sourced directly from domestic shale operations. And because American producers are completely insulated from the Middle Eastern maritime blockades, they are currently operating with a massive structural cost advantage. This dynamic has created what analysts are calling a K-shaped divergence in the global market, separating the ethane-based haves from the naphtha-based have-nots. Western chemical giants like LyondellBasell and Dow have seen their stock prices surge by over 70% since the beginning of this year. These American corporations are aggressively capturing pricing power by pushing price hikes into a structurally undersupplied global market. The CEO of Dow recently stated that the die is cast for high petrochemical prices through the end of 2026. But despite this localized American windfall, the sheer volume of capacity being removed from Asia guarantees that global supply chains will remain severely compromised. Approximately 5% of the entire global ethylene production capacity was already shut down by late March, and that number just continues to climb. The consequences of this industrial freeze extend far beyond basic plastics and packaging materials because the global technology sector is deeply intertwined with these highly specific chemical derivatives. Semiconductor fabrication requires over 500 specialized chemicals to transform a raw silicon wafer into a functioning microchip. Or naphtha-derived aromatic compounds are the foundational ingredients for photoresists, which are the light-sensitive polymer coatings essential for microscopic circuit etching. Or the ultra-pure solvents used for wafer cleaning and residue removal are all directly derived from propylene chains produced in these now shuttered steam crackers. All very technical and all very important. Now, Taiwan currently manufactures the vast majority of the world's most advanced semiconductors, and their chemical supply chain is heavily exposed to this exact disruption. The South Korean government has explicitly identified 14 critical items within their semiconductor supply chain that face severe exposure to the Middle East conflict. And because chip manufacturers operate under incredibly strict quality control standards, they cannot simply swap out their chemical suppliers without enduring months and months of rigorous requalification testing. This means, in other words, even if alternative chemical sources are eventually secured, the administrative delays alone will severely restrict global semiconductor output. To make matters worse, the Qatari industrial facilities that were damaged in the recent drone strikes normally supply roughly 30% of the world's helium. Now, helium is absolutely critical for the plasma processes used in chip fabrication, adding a devastating second thought to the global semiconductor supply crunch. And the situation looks even worse when we examine the essential supplies required by the global healthcare system. You see, medical devices and pharmaceutical packaging account for over 60% of all medical plastic demand worldwide. So, an ordinary intravenous fluid bag is constructed entirely from polyvinyl chloride and polypropylene, both of which trace their origins directly back to the steam cracking process. Medical-grade plastics must adhere to incredibly rigid international safety standards, meaning hospitals cannot simply substitute cheaper materials during a supply shortage. The regulatory rigidity of the healthcare sector means that a disruption in upstream chemical feeds translates directly into a physical shortage of life-saving equipment. The South Korean government recently warned that their domestic inventory for all of these vital medical polymers could be completely depleted within a matter of weeks. And at the same time, the global automotive industry is facing a massive bottleneck regarding the engineered plastics required for modern vehicle production. Petrochemical derivatives currently account for roughly 15 to 17% of a standard passenger vehicle's total weight. So everything from the polyurethane foam inside the seating to the synthetic rubber in the tires requires steady flow of these fundamental chemical building blocks. So as these materials become increasingly scarce, automotive manufacturers will be forced to ration their production lines and prioritize only their highest margin vehicles. And this begs the question of how these massive upstream supply failures eventually impact the broader macroeconomic landscape and your personal finances. The transmission mechanism from a chemical shortage in Asia to the price of consumer goods in your local store operates with a built-in time lag. So when steam crackers go dark, the immediate consequence is a rapid drawdown of existing downstream chemical inventories. Once these physical buffers are exhausted, however, the manufacturers of automotive parts, medical equipment, or consumer electronics are forced to aggressively bid up the remaining supply. The CEO of Dow recently warned that even if the geopolitical conflict ended today, unwinding these massive supply chain disruptions would take up to 275 days. This mathematical reality dictates that the staggering cost increases occurring at the factory level today will not fully hit consumer shelves until late 2026. The worst, it seems, is yet to come. We are effectively watching the formation of a massive inflationary tsunami that is currently traveling across the ocean completely undetected by the general public. This dynamic functions as an invisible tax on every single manufactured good on Earth, collected not by governments, but by the physics of global supply chains. Major consumer goods companies that were previously attempting to cut prices to revive demand are now being forced to implement severe shrinkflation just to maintain their margins. The Plastics Exchange recently reported its highest weekly transaction volume in 25 years, driven entirely by corporate panic buying and supply uncertainty. When procurement managers realize that raw materials are vanishing, they immediately begin hoarding whatever inventory they can find, which only violently accelerates the price spikes. And the most terrifying aspect of this impending price shock is that global central banks are structurally powerless to stop it. Institutions like the Federal Reserve use interest rate hikes to suppress consumer demand and cool down an overheating economy. But the crisis we are witnessing today is purely physical supply-side shock, so not a demand-driven phenomenon. Raising the federal funds rate will not magically manufacture more chemical feedstocks or force marine insurers to underwrite vessels entering a conflict zone. This is just sadly not how it works. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has explicitly acknowledged that monetary policy tools have absolutely no meaningful effect on these specific types of supply shocks. The Fed has maintained its benchmark rate between 3.75 and 4.25%, effectively surrendering to the reality that it cannot fix a broken physical supply chain. Central bankers are thus trapped in a devastating stagflationary dilemma with absolutely no viable exit strategy. If they aggressively raise interest rates to combat the rising prices of manufactured goods, they risk crushing economic growth and triggering a deep, deep recession. But if they prematurely cut rates to stimulate the slowing economy, they risk permanently unanchoring inflation expectations and repeating the disastrous policy mistakes of the 1970s. You see, during the 1973 oil embargo, Western central banks initially cut interest rates to encourage growth after a massive supply shock, which ultimately deepened and lengthened the resulting stagflation. And the current disruption in the Strait of Hormuz has actually removed a larger percentage of global supply than that infamous historical embargo. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, is already projecting that United States inflation will remain severely elevated at 4.2% throughout 2026. Meanwhile, the European Central Bank has slashed their Eurozone growth projection to a miserable 0.9%, while simultaneously raising their inflation forecasts. This is the textbook definition of a stagflationary environment where prices continue to soar even as economic productivity grinds to an absolute halt. Goldman Sachs has officially described this maritime closure as the largest supply shock in the history of global crude market. They have subsequently raised the probability of a major economic recession to 30%, while Moody's Analytics places that probability even higher at nearly 49%. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index recently plummeted to 53.3%, which is a level historically associated with an active or imminent economic recession. The 10-year Treasury yield has remained stubbornly elevated at 4.3%, signaling that the bond market is already pricing in a prolonged era of structural inflation. This unfolding crisis exposes a massive structural vulnerability that has been building within the global economy for decades. Asian manufacturers deliberately chose to build naphtha-based steam crackers because they offer incredible flexibility, producing a wide array of chemical byproducts alongside basic ethylene. But this industrial flexibility came with a fatal geographic flaw, concentrating up to 80% of their critical feedstock sourcing into a single geopolitical choke point. The current meltdown is proving that highly optimized, just-in-time supply chains are fundamentally incompatible with a fracturing geopolitical landscape. Retooling these massive Asian facilities to accept alternative feedstocks like ethane or butane would require billions of dollars in capital expenditure and years of construction. Therefore, there is absolutely no short-term technological fix that can bridge the massive production void currently rippling through the market. You see, we have officially entered what industry analysts are calling the force majeure era of global trade, when multiple multinational corporations simultaneously declare that they can no longer fulfill their legal contracts. The very foundation of global commerce begins to fracture. Downstream manufacturers cannot confidently plan their production schedules. They cannot commit to delivery dates, and they are ultimately forced to initiate their own cascading production cuts. This creates a devastating multiplier effect where a localized shortage of chemical feedstocks completely paralyzes tens of trillions of dollars worth of finished goods. And the collateral damage of this petrochemical shortage is even spilling over into the global agriculture sector. The same natural gas and chemical infrastructure that has been disrupted in the Middle East is also vital for the production of synthetic fertilizers. Experts from the National University of Singapore have warned that this compounding shortage could push an additional 45 million people into extreme hunger by late 2026. This perfectly illustrates how the hidden workings of the global economy connect a damaged refinery in the Persian Gulf directly to the cost of food on your plate. The era of cheap and frictionless global manufacturing has come to an abrupt and permanent end. We are no longer dealing with a temporary logistical bottleneck that can be resolved by simply rerouting a few container ships. The collapse of the Middle Eastern Naphtha trade serves as the definitive smoking gun for a massive stagflationary recession. Every single manufactured object that relies on these chemical precursors is about to experience a profound and unavoidable cost revaluation. And because of the structural time lags built into global logistics, the financial pain we are locking in today will ultimately drain your bank account tomorrow. But what do you reckon about this massive disruption to the global manufacturing base? Do you think alternative feedstocks can eventually, hopefully, replace this lost capacity, or is a devastating wave of consumer inflation mathematically impossible to avoid? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you want to understand how shifting geopolitical alliances are actively threatening the dominance of the US dollar, then consider checking out our video on the petrodollar right over here. That's all from me today. So as always, thank you for watching. Stay safe and I'll see you soon. This is DC signing off.